General Townsend, what is China doing in Africa? And why does it threaten us? That question asked before the U.S. Congress wasn't whispered in some backroom. It was broadcast, documented, etched into the official record of America's foreign policy. But the real question isn't what China is doing in Africa. It's why the United States feels so threatened by it. Across the vast savannas of West Africa and the crowded ports of East Africa, roads are being paved, power grids are expanding, and new partnerships are being formed not by Washington, not by Paris, but by Beijing and Moscow. And suddenly, Africa's name is back on the lips of every Western general diplomat and news anchor. But not for the reasons you might think. They say they're protecting Africa from debt traps. They say they're defending democracy. But what if they're just defending their own interests? Because for decades, Africa was not asked what it needed. It was told who to borrow from, who to trade with, who to allow into its borders, and who to keep out. Today, countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer asking for permission. They're forging new ties, saying no to Western dictates, and that more than anything has shaken the halls of power in Washington and Brussels. So let's ask it plainly. Why is Africa punished for choosing its own partners? Is independence only acceptable if it aligns with Western approval? And who really benefits when Africa is kept divided and poor? If these are questions that have stirred something in you, perhaps frustration, perhaps hope, then you're in the right place. This is not a channel that tells Africa what to think. It's a place where Africa speaks, and we listen clearly, deeply, and without filters. If you believe that Africa deserves to choose its own destiny without interference, then stand with us. Like this video. Share it with someone who still thinks Africa must ask permission to rise. And subscribe if you believe that truth should speak louder than power. It didn't start with tanks or soldiers. It started with roads, with railways, with power stations, hospitals, fiber optic cables, and shipping ports. And it started with a decision China made a deliberate choice to compete with the United States in Africa and to win. That's not speculation. That's a direct quote from General Stephen Townsend, former commander of U.S. Africa Command, spoken on record before Congress. His concern wasn't hypothetical. It was strategic, calculated, and urgent. China is actively seeking a military base on Africa's Atlantic coast. And that, for a variety of reasons, would be bad for America's security, he warned. Let that sink in. A Chinese military presence in Africa on the other side of the ocean is considered a national security threat to the United States. But General Townsend wasn't just talking about guns and ships. He was talking about a different kind of war, a war for influence. And on that front, China isn't marching. It's building. Across the continent, Chinese companies are laying the bricks of a new infrastructure, one that doesn't depend on the IMF or the World Bank. In Zambia, they're electrifying rural clinics. In Ethiopia, they've financed an entire railway. In Nigeria, they're helping construct a multi-billion-dollar deep-sea port. And in Djibouti, China already operates its first overseas military base just miles away from an American one. To Washington, this is a red flag. To many Africans, it's a lifeline. But here's where the story gets more complicated. The West, particularly the United States, claims to be defending Africa from China's so-called debt trap diplomacy. The idea is that China lends money to African nations knowing they'll struggle to repay, thus gaining leverage and control. It sounds ominous. And in some cases, the concerns are valid. But it also rings hollow, coming from the same institutions that held Africa in structural debt for decades through Western-controlled entities like the IMF and World Bank, lending money tied to strict austerity measures, privatization of public goods, and the weakening of national sovereignty. In truth, many African leaders are not naive. They know that China isn't offering charity, but they also know that having choices changes the game. And that's what makes Washington nervous. Because for decades, the U.S. and its allies were the only show in town. Their money, their weapons, their votes at the UN, their conditions. But now countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are walking away from that monopoly. They're turning to new partners on their own terms. Burkina Faso has expelled French troops and shut down military outposts. Mali has canceled security agreements with Western powers and welcomed new forms of defense cooperation. Niger has begun questioning colonial-era mining contracts and exploring alternative trade routes. And they're not doing this behind closed doors. They're announcing it, boldly, publicly. For the first time in decades, African leaders are looking outward, not with begging bowls, but with blueprints. And the response from the West, a sudden flurry of headlines about instability, accusations of dictatorship, sanctions, warnings, threats. But ask the people in the streets of Ouagadougou or Bamako, and they'll tell you this isn't instability, this is reclamation. Not a coup against democracy, but a coup against dependency. The moment everything changed wasn't televised. It wasn't even announced from a podium in Washington or Paris. It happened quietly but unmistakably when a group of African nations led by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began making decisions that didn't require Western approval. And the first real shock? They said no. No to military bases. No to exploitative contracts. No to a definition of democracy designed elsewhere and imposed from above. That single word, no, shattered decades of unspoken agreements between African governments and their former colonial masters. In Burkina Faso, interim President Ibrahim Traoré expelled French troops, closed down the French military mission, and openly questioned why foreign powers maintained such heavy footprints in Sahelian soil. In Mali, the transitional government broke security agreements with France and ECOWAS and signed fresh partnerships with non-Western allies. In Niger, the rejection of mining concessions that benefited Europe more than local communities sent shockwaves through Brussels and Washington. These weren't isolated moves. They were part of a coordinated unraveling, a deliberate rejection of a post-colonial order that had long treated Africa as a warehouse of raw materials, cheap labor, and military real estate. And the reaction from the West, immediate, predictable, fierce. Economic sanctions aid was frozen, trade agreements delayed, regional banking systems were weaponized to pressure defiant governments. Diplomatic pressure, Western embassies issued statements warning of instability and democratic backsliding. Media campaigns, leading outlets branded Traoré and his allies as authoritarian strongmen, populist firebrands, or Russian proxies. But the truth on the ground was far more complicated and far more powerful. Across the capitals of West Africa, something began to stir. Something that couldn't be easily dismissed. People young and old, educated and poor, took to the streets not in protest of their governments, but in support. They waved their national flags, not French ones. They held banners that read, "We are not your subjects. We are your equals." And in a moment that caught the world's attention, thousands in Ouagadougou sang the name of Ibrahim Traoré, not as a politician, but as a symbol, a representation of what it means to finally be unafraid. This wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Western officials called it dangerous. But to many Africans, it was liberation. Because for decades, their choices had always been conditional. You could have democracy as long as it came with IMF conditions. You could have elections as long as the winners served Western interests. You could have peace as long as you didn't question the presence of foreign troops. Now that equation was breaking, and those who had written the old rules were scrambling to rewrite the script. At the United Nations, African delegations began speaking with more unity, more defiance. At the African Union, speeches turned into indictments criticizing foreign aid dependency and calling for a new financing structure not tied to outside donors. Even in Kenya, a traditionally Western-aligned country, the president stood before the African Union and said, "We must open our borders to each other. We must not fear fellow Africans. We must abolish visa requirements between our nations. Let us remove the shackles of colonialism still embedded in our minds." That statement wasn't just about tourism or paperwork. It was about undoing the Berlin Conference, the map-drawing exercise of 1885 that divided Africa by European logic and left behind a legacy of suspicion, division, and weakness. Now the leaders of today were calling to reverse that process, not with violence, but with sovereign will. And once again, the fear in Western capitals was palpable, not because of bombs, not because of coups, but because Africa was awakening and it was no longer asking for permission. When a nation breaks free, truly free, it doesn't happen in silence. It echoes through its streets, its classrooms, its hospitals. It reflects in how people eat, work, sleep, and dream. And in Africa today, those echoes are becoming real consequences, both hopeful and painful. In countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the decision to reject foreign military presence and economic dependency came with bold speeches. But it also came with real trade-offs. Electricity grids, once supplemented by Western infrastructure funds, now run on tighter budgets. Medical shipments delayed or blocked due to aid freezes have created shortages in rural clinics. Inflation, driven in part by economic sanctions and severed trade links, has made food and fuel more expensive. And yet, despite these pressures, something remarkable is happening. People are adapting. In Ouagadougou, volunteers have formed neighborhood watch patrols to fill the void left by departing French troops. In Bamako, community-run markets are sourcing local produce instead of relying on expensive imports. In Niamey, young students have launched study groups on African political thought, inspired by the speeches of leaders like Thomas Sankara and Ibrahim Traoré. This isn't romanticism, it's resistance. A resistance born not out of hatred but out of necessity. Because for many Africans, the choice isn't between prosperity and poverty. It's between proud poverty and humiliated dependency. And if they must suffer either way, they now choose to suffer on their own terms. Across the Sahel and beyond, the very idea of governance is being rewritten. The old model built on ballots that answered to donors more than voters is being questioned. In Burkina Faso, President Traoré dissolved the National Electoral Commission, arguing that elections imposed from outside cannot represent the will of the people. Instead, he proposed a new civic council system made up of elders, farmers, women, leaders, and youth representatives. In Mali, the transitional government is investing in local justice systems, empowering village elders and customary law to resolve disputes instead of relying solely on state-appointed judges trained in colonial French legal codes. In Niger, a new resource ownership bill is under debate which would give local communities veto power over foreign mining projects, something unheard of just a few years ago. Of course, not everyone agrees. Opposition figures argue that these changes bypass democratic norms. Western analysts call them backsliding or illiberal. But to many Africans, it's not backsliding. It's backtracking to truth, returning to systems of leadership that predate colonization rooted in consensus responsibility and community dignity. One of colonialism's most dangerous legacies wasn't just economic control, it was mental control. The idea that Europe knows best, that African nations must be taught, managed, corrected. But now that illusion is crumbling. In street murals across Bamako and Niamey, slogans like La Patrie ou la Mort, the homeland or death, reappear not as threats, but as affirmations. Local radio stations debate African philosophy, not European law. University students reject textbooks written in Paris and instead translate speeches from Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, and Sankara. Even the word sovereignty, once reserved for diplomats and generals, has entered the mouths of fishermen, market women, and schoolchildren. A vegetable seller in Bobo Dioulasso put it best in a recent interview: "I may not know what the IMF is, but I know what it means when a foreigner owns my land. And I know what it feels like when we say enough." For every step forward, there are traps. Some Western-backed opposition groups are mobilizing to destabilize governments, pursuing independent paths. Cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns attempt to smear leaders like Traoré as puppets of China or Russia. Foreign companies sue African governments in international courts for trying to nationalize resources. Even inside Africa, not all leaders agree. Some fear the consequences. Some are still tied to old alliances. Some simply don't believe sovereignty is realistic. But one thing is now undeniable. The conversation has changed. No longer is it about which aid package is better. Now it's about whether aid is even necessary or whether Africa can and should fund its own destiny. And for many, that shift of mindset, not just policy, is the most dangerous thing of all, for those who've long profited from African weakness. From Washington to Brussels, the rise of a self-determined Africa is not seen as a hopeful moment. It is seen as a strategic problem. For decades, Africa was treated as a passive participant in global affairs, a region to be stabilized, assisted, lectured, or contained. Now, with countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger rejecting Western military bases, questioning IMF loans, and forging new partnerships with China and Russia, the tone has shifted from condescending to concerned. At recent congressional hearings in the United States, officials openly admitted that China's deepening ties with Africa pose a direct threat to American influence. General Townsend, testifying under oath, warned that a Chinese base on the Atlantic coast of Africa would be bad for America's security. But why? It's not just about military outposts or trade routes. It's about leverage. Who gets to shape Africa's future? Who sits at the table when new infrastructure is built? Who gets first access to resources like lithium, cobalt, and uranium? To many in the West, and Africa choosing its own partners represents not freedom, but loss of control. Even Western think tanks have admitted as much. Reports from institutions like Chatham House and the Brookings Institution highlight the risk that African countries may begin aligning with global actors that do not share democratic values. But the subtext is clear. Democracy is often code for aligned with us. The European Union has responded by proposing a new global gateway initiative, essentially a rival to China's Belt and Road, but critics argue that it's too little too late. China has already built deep relationships on the ground roads, hospitals, universities, and more. Russia, too, has offered military partnerships without the governance lectures that often accompany NATO deals. Meanwhile, voices inside the U.S. are split. Some argue for deeper engagement with African civil society and business, not just governments. Others warn that if Washington continues to treat Africa as a pawn in its rivalry with Beijing or Moscow, it will only push African nations further away. In short, the West is waking up to a new geopolitical reality. Africa is no longer the chessboard. It is becoming a player. And that change doesn't just threaten old alliances, it threatens the very assumptions on which Western foreign policy was built. This was never just about Africa. It was and remains a mirror, a reflection of everything the global order promised, and everything it failed to deliver. For decades, the world's most powerful nations claimed to support African development, democracy, and stability. But when African countries began making decisions without Western oversight, when they chose to walk alone, suddenly those same voices cried foul. They called it instability. They called it chaos. But in truth, what they feared was clarity. Because the moment Africa stood up, it revealed a deeper truth. That global partnership often meant dependency. That foreign aid often came with strings. That sovereignty, when real, would come at a cost and with confrontation. Today, what we are witnessing in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and beyond is not a collapse. It is a correction. It is not anti-Western. It is pro-African. But that doesn't mean the path ahead will be easy. Western powers will not surrender influence lightly. Disinformation campaigns will intensify. Economic levers will be pulled, and attempts will be made to divide Africans ethnically, politically, and regionally. That is why clarity matters now more than ever. Africa is not rising with weapons. It is rising with questions. Why must we depend on others for what we already have? Why are our borders still shaped by colonial rulers? Why are we punished when we choose partners outside of Washington, Paris, or London? These are not dangerous questions. They are necessary ones. Because until they are answered, Africa will never truly be free, and neither will the global conscience that still turns away from injustice when it's not convenient. So we leave you with this. Do you believe that African nations have the right to choose their future even if it challenges your country's power? Should sovereignty be conditional or absolute? And most importantly, can we continue to trust President Ibrahim Traoré's bold reform strategies? Or is it time to envision new African leadership? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, respectfully, thoughtfully, and with courage. If this video gave you something to think about, please like it. If you believe that truth matters more than headlines, please share it. And if you stand with a continent rising on its own terms, subscribe and stay informed, because the battle for Africa's future is far from over. And what happens next concerns us all.